The house still smells of lavender and rot. That's what Eleanor Clark, the last living person to enter the Ashford estate, whispered after being pulled from the premises in 1964. She had been inside for only 11 minutes. When they found her, she was barefoot, her fingernails torn and bleeding, as if she had tried to claw through the oak-paneled walls themselves. The doctor said she suffered a break and acute dissociation. But even sedated, she kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. They didn't die. They became something else. The Ashford family was once the crown jewel of Black Hollow, Massachusetts. The kind of family people nodded to on the streets but never invited over. Polite, generous with donations, silent about everything else. They lived in a sprawling Victorian mansion atop Elder's Hill, a place the locals once called Witch's Rise, until the name mysteriously disappeared from town records. On November 3, 1892, the family vanished. No bodies were found. No one heard screams. The estate gates were locked from the inside and the doors bolted. The fireplaces had gone cold. The clocks, every single one, had stopped at 3:17. But the table was set for 5. That detail still unsettles historians. There were only 3 people known to live in the home at the time: Thomas Ashford, his wife Margaret, and their daughter, Amelia. Yet the table was arranged with 5 sets of silverware, 5 wine glasses, 5 half-eaten meals. The house showed no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Just a creeping silence, a scent of spoiled meat and rotting roses, and something else no one could explain: a residual chill, as if the very walls had exhaled a long, weary breath. Some say the Ashfords were cursed. Others say they invited the curse in. Over the decades, theories sprouted like weeds. Some spoke of black magic. Others, secret societies. There were rumors of seances, whispers of pagan blood rites. Strange fires glimpsed through upper windows during the witching hour. But the truth has always remained just out of reach, like a shape in a fog, retreating the closer you come. Even the investigation was off. Sheriff Connolly, who led the initial search, resigned only days later. His final report was only 2 pages long. The last sentence, scrawled in what looked like a shaking hand, simply read, "I will not speak of that place again." A new sheriff was appointed, but the townsfolk had already made up their minds. The Ashford estate was cursed, haunted, tainted. They boarded it up, sealed the gates with iron chains, and declared it off limits. Over time, the house sank back into the earth, shrouded in ivy, dust, and myth. But it didn't forget Dot in the years that followed. Strange events plagued the town. Children born with webbed fingers. Animals found mutilated on church steps. A priest who walked into the forest and never returned. But always, at the center of every rumor, was the hill, the house, and the family whose name had become more of a warning than a memory. And then, in 1964, Eleanor Clark broke in. She was a graduate student in folklore, fascinated by the occult. She had come to Black Hollow to research local myths. The Ashfords were her obsession. She ignored the warnings, the faded "keep out" signs, the rusted lock on the gate. She snuck inside the estate just after sunset. She left screaming. When they found her, she was lying in the drawing room, curled beneath a shattered mirror. Her shoes were missing. Her eyes refused to focus. She wouldn't say what she saw, only that something was watching her. Breathing, waiting. She died 3 years later in a psychiatric hospital. Her final sketchbook, filled during her institutionalization, was filled with repeated drawings of a single shape, a tall figure with no face, standing behind a girl at a dinner table, its hand resting gently on her shoulder. To this day, no one knows what really happened to the Ashfords. Some believe they vanished into another realm. Others say they never left, that their spirits, or whatever they became, are still there, waiting. and every so often, people claimed to hear soft violin music drifting down from Elders Hill, just before midnight, just before everything goes quiet. There's a reason no one lives in Black Hollow anymore. There's a reason the trees grow twisted at the edge of the estate. And there's a reason some questions are better left unanswered. Because whatever happened to the Ashford family wasn't an accident. It was a decision, a ritual, a door open that should have stayed shut. And now, we live with the echo. Asterisk. In 1885, Black Hollow was a town built on restraint, on tightly drawn curtains, whispered church confessions, and the unspoken belief that if you pretended not to see evil, it might pretend not to see you. The town sat nestled between forests that had never been fully cleared, and hills that grew too quiet after dusk. It had one schoolhouse, one church, and two undertakers, because death came in waves in Black Hollow, and never by accident. But above all this, watching with cold detachment, was the Ashford estate. It sat like a mausoleum dressed as a mansion grand. Yes, but humorless. 3 floors of gabled roofs, stained glass, and a black iron gate with no known key. It had been built quickly and deliberately, and no one in town knew the name of the architect. Only that it wasn't local. Thomas Ashford arrived in Black Hollow as a man already hollowed out. A shipping tycoon from Boston, he moved inland after a storm at sea took the lives of 2 of his sons. They were never recovered. Some say he spent a fortune trying to locate their bodies. Others say he hired mediums and whispered to water. He bought the land on Elders Hill that same year. It had once belonged to Puritan settlers who abandoned it after a series of fires and infant deaths. The townspeople didn't question why he wanted it. They were just grateful someone did. But they kept their distance, even from the beginning. There was something about Thomas. His grief was not loud, not public. It was dense. Like lead. Margaret Ashford, his wife, was another story. A woman with eyes too sharp and hands too still. She had a voice that soothed and unsettled, and a reputation for strange gatherings. It started with afternoon readings with women from Boston. Then the rumors began that they lit black candles, that the air around the house smelled of myrrh, that the women entered laughing and left pale, as if something had been pulled from them. Margaret began teaching her daughter, Amelia, to chant prayers in languages no one else understood. The cook resigned after finding feathers wrapped in red, twined beneath the girl's pillow. When questioned, Margaret smiled and said, "She's just imaginative." Like her father used to be, before the ocean took him. Amelia was different. There's no gentler word. She was pale, quiet, almost translucent in her stillness. Her hair was always perfectly combed, her dresses always spotless. But the school teachers noticed odd things, how she wouldn't eat during the day, only at dusk. How she always knew who would be absent from class before attendance was taken. How she sat at recess alone, whispering into the dirt, and once drew a map of the school that included rooms that didn't exist, until they were later discovered in the building's original blueprints. She never cried, never laughed, just watched. By 1890, most of the town had learned not to speak about the Ashfords in public. Not because of fear, though fear played its part, but because no one wanted to invite the family shadow into their own homes. They were a riddle, yes, but they were a quiet one. And as long as they stayed up on Elders Hill, people were content to let them rot in peace. And yet, strange things began happening anyway. Dogs refused to walk near the Ashford gate, whining and pulling away until their owners turned back. The postman refused to deliver past the front gate. 3 different replacements were hired over 2 years. All quit. One left the job after claiming to see Margaret Ashford standing behind an upstairs window with her hands covered in what looked like soot or blood. One boy, Daniel Thatcher, claimed he had broken into the estate on a dare. he never made. It passed the garden before vomiting violently and sprinting home. He told his friends he heard something speaking inside his head, something that spoke in backwards words. He disappeared the following winter. His body was never found. By 1892, the Ashfords had stopped appearing in public altogether. The curtains were always drawn. No visitors arrived. The only sound from the house came on cold nights, when wind carried the echo of music, soft piano or high, sorrowful violin. Sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. Still, no one went up the hill. Not anymore. Not until November 3rd, when the estate fell silent, when no smoke curled from the chimney, when no deliveries were accepted, when the gate remained chained for 3 days straight. That's when the town made a decision. They gathered 6 men, 3 townsfolk, to clergy, and the new sheriff, and they approached the house together. They didn't speak during the walk. They didn't pray. They just brought crowbars, lanterns, and the growing, gnawing suspicion that the Ashfords hadn't just disappeared. They had completed something. What they would find inside would not make sense, would not follow logic or natural order. But one thing was certain: even before the door creaked open, something inside had changed. And nothing in Black Hollow would ever be the same again. It was just after noon when they broke the chain. The iron had rusted shut, almost fused together by time and weather. But Sheriff Avery and the others managed to snap it loose with a crowbar and something like hesitation. The Ashford gate moaned as it swung open slowly, like it didn't want to. Like it remembered. No one spoke as they walked up the gravel path. The house loomed above, its windows like blackened eyes. The grass had grown wild, but not high. Something had been trampling it in narrow paths that looped in spirals, like crop circles in soil. The wind that day was still, too still. The air carried a smell, faint, metallic, sour. But what struck them most was the silence. Not a single bird, not a chirp, not a flutter. As if the world had decided this small corner of Black Hollow no longer existed. When they reached the door, they found it locked, but not forcibly. The key was still inside. They assumed turned neatly in the ornate brass knob. Sheriff Avery knocked once, not because he expected a response, but because he needed the gesture. Then, with a breath, he raised the butt of his rifle and shattered the stained glass window on the front panel. It felt like colored teeth. The moment they stepped inside, the cold hit them. Not just temperature, but something else. Something that didn't belong in July. The foyer was intact. Immaculate, even. A chandelier of crystal and bone hung above them, glinting in the light from their lanterns. Dust was thick on the banisters, but there were footprints in it, small, bare, leading down the hall and disappearing behind the velvet curtain that separated the east wing. They didn't follow them. Not yet. The dining room was the first real crack in reality. The table was laid out perfectly. Silver gleamed. Plates were set, wine glasses half full. But the food had rotted down to black pulp maggots twisted through what once might have been meat or fruit. And the smell was what nearly made one of the men, Reverend Hale, drop to his knees. It was old death, not fresh, not flesh. It smelled like something that had never been alive at all. There were 5 place settings. Everyone knew the Ashfords were 3. They left the dining room in silence, but not before Sheriff Avery noted the time on the grandfather clock against the far wall, 3:17. The hands were frozen. When he opened the back of the casing, he found the gears intact, wound tightly, as if someone had forced it to stop. In the hallway leading to the study, every painting had been turned to face the wall. One of the men, George Kelly, turned one over. It was a portrait of Amelia, age 7, in a white dress, holding a small wooden box. Her expression was distant, eyes wide. But the detail that turned Kelly's skin to ice was the reflection in the glass. There was something behind her. A tall, dark silhouette, unpainted but present. Faint, like someone had scratched it in after the portrait had dried. They found the library door ajar. Dozens of books lay in piles around the floor, none on shelves. All were open. All had certain pages torn out. Scripture, ritual, myth, anatomy. The fire was out, but the ashes were still warm. In the hearth lay a doll, charred, eyes missing. The master bedroom was untouched. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, but on the ceiling spanning the entire surface was a series of chalk markings. Circles, crosses, and a word scrawled over and over again in what looked like dried ink, but smelled unmistakably like copper. Return. It was Amelia's bedroom that finally broke them. The door creaked open into a space too cold for July, too quiet for a house that once held music and laughter. The walls were covered with pages, hundreds of them, drawings pinned up edge to edge like wallpaper, all drawn in crayon or charcoal. Eyes, mouths, doors, more eyes, and in the center of the room, a perfect circle of melted wax. 12 candles, burned down to nothing. The bed was untouched, made with precision, but on the pillow was a single lock of hair, blonde, wrapped in a ribbon. Reverend Halley whispered a prayer. The moment he did, the candle holders, every one of them, toppled over at the same time, as if struck by a sudden gust of wind. But the air hadn't moved. That's when the sheriff said, "We leave. Now." They exited the house in silence, leaving the curtains swaying behind them. Later, that night, one of the men claimed he saw lights flickering in the third-floor window. He swore it wasn't lantern light. It pulsed blue and unnatural. And he said, as God was his witness, he saw a figure in the glass. A girl, watching, smiling. None of the men ever spoke publicly about what they saw again. Sheriff Avery burned his coat. Reverend Halley left the clergy. George Kelly left town entirely and was never heard from again. Black Hollow began to wither. People didn't visit anymore. Children left. The post office closed. The church caught fire in the fall. No explanation ever found. And the Ashford estate? It sat, waiting, because nothing had been solved. Nothing had been found. And something, whatever, had been awakened in that house had only just begun to breathe. Years later, after the Ashford estate had been sealed shut and the town of Black Hollow had begun its slow death, the documents started to surface. It began with an auction in 1947, quiet, private, attended only by a few estate lawyers and a historian from Boston named Harold Sims. Among the unsold furniture and water-damaged portraits was a leather-bound trunk with no key. When pried open, it revealed a collection of family records, personal diaries and sketches, none of which had ever been logged in the original police reports. The contents should have been mundane. They weren't. One of the most disturbing discoveries was Margaret Ashford's personal journal. Her handwriting, once elegant, deteriorated sharply over the final 6 months. The tone shifted from grief-stricken to euphoric to almost unreadable. The last full entry is still debated by researchers. It reads, "The veil has grown thin. We see them now, not as ghosts, not as demons, but as what we once were. Eyes without faces. Mouths that never stop singing. And they've taught Amelia their names." Some dismissed the passage as the result of mental illness, but others saw patterns. In the margins of that same journal were symbols, dozens of them drawn over and over in different inks. A linguist from Miskatonic University identified several as matching glyphs found in pre-Christian sacrificial sites across northern Europe. Glyphs never known to be in the Americas. At least, not until now. Then came the sketches, some attributed to Margaret, others clearly by Amelia, childlike but obsessive. One page depicted a group of shadowy figures standing around a dinner table. 5 seats, 5 shadows, and in the middle a hollow circle. Beneath it, in a child's block letters, "The empty one comes last." Psychologists speculated this was symbolic, an expression of trauma or fear. But folklorists offered something else, a reference to a nearly forgotten pagan entity once referred to in whispers as the guest who was never born. An old myth tied to rituals of silence and vanishing. Then there were the testimonies, the kind that were buried, unreported, dismissed as hearsay. In 1939, a woman named Judith Heller came forward claiming her grandmother had worked as a maid for the Ashfords. She said Margaret once caught her looking at Amelia's drawings and took her by the wrist, staring into her eyes. That girl, Margaret allegedly whispered, was not meant for this century. When Heller's grandmother quit, she never worked again. She refused to speak of what she saw in the mirrors. She covered everyone in her house until the day she died. In another account, unearthed in an unpublished memoir by Harold Sims himself, there's mention of a small wooden box found inside the Ashford Library. It was sealed shut with wax and engraved with the words, "Open only when the song begins." Inside was a length of human hair, perfectly braided, tied with a violet ribbon. The hair, tested in the 1970s, was confirmed to be from a child between the ages of 8 and 10. Carbon dating estimated it to be at least 80 years older than Amelia Ashford. The implication? The child had lived before the Ashfords, or returned through her. Sims became obsessed. Over the course of 20 years, he gathered everything he could: maps, family trees, correspondence, photographs. But the photographs began to change. At first, they were clear, black and white portraits, stiff Victorian poses. But with time, the figures began to fade. Only the Ashfords. In every image, their outlines grew blurry. Amelia's face disappeared entirely in one photo, leaving just her dress, standing empty on the front lawn. Experts blame humidity. Sims blamed something else. He wrote, "I believe the Ashfords are being erased by the very force they worshipped. Not destroyed, rewritten." By 1962, Sims claimed to hear music at night, a violin playing in a room no one else could hear. He swore it followed him. 2 years later, he took his own life. His final note read, "It's not a haunting. It's a memory that refuses to die." Even now, none of the evidence lines up neatly. Diaries filled with impossible languages. Sketches that predict real people's deaths. Theories abound from mass hysteria to psychological inheritance. But the contradictions don't end there. Take the Ashford Family will, filed in 1888. In it, Thomas leaves everything to our firstborn son. But by every record, their sons had drowned years earlier. And Amelia, their only surviving child, is never mentioned by name, only referred to as the vessel. What kind of father forgets his daughter? Unless she wasn't his daughter at all. Unless she was something else. The deeper you go, the more the evidence begins to resist interpretation. It doesn't just confuse, it disorients. Like the story itself doesn't want to be understood. And perhaps that's the most disturbing detail of all, because some mysteries hide in shadows, but others, they bury themselves inside the mind, and once you let them in, they don't leave. Black Hollow never truly recovered. Not after the Ashfords disappeared. At first, the town tried to go on as if nothing had happened. They said their prayers, closed their windows tighter, sent their children to school, and refused to answer their questions. But the absence wasn't quiet. It echoed. You could feel it on Main Street, where shopkeepers began locking up early. Even in summer, when the sun still hung in the sky at 7. You could hear it in the voices of the congregation, their hymns quieter, less certain. People began dreaming strange dreams, shared dreams, of a white dress floating through the woods, of music without a source, of a face at the window, mouth open in a scream you couldn't hear. Something had changed, but no one wanted to name it. They simply began to vanish. First came the resignations. The schoolteacher left midterm, citing nervous exhaustion. The pastor stepped down and moved to Kansas without giving a final sermon. The constable who helped break into the estate developed tremors in both hands, then refused to speak altogether. He lived another 20 years, but never uttered a single word again. And then came the families, packing up wagons in the dead of night, not saying goodbye, not selling their homes, just gone, one by one, until Black Hollow began to feel like a town mourning something it never had a name for. A town holding its breath. For those who stayed, the fear began to change them. Children weren't allowed to play near the woods. Mirrors were removed from homes or covered in thick black cloth. People spoke of shadows that didn't move right, of reflections that blinked when you didn't. A woman named Elsie Caldwell locked herself in her attic for 2 months, scribbling poems in chalk on the walls. She claimed she saw Margaret Ashford in her dreams, whispering to her from behind a veil of flies. Her husband found her hanging from the rafters, her final words scratched into the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She's not asleep. She's listening. Grief, paranoia, and inherited guilt took hold like a sickness. The town doctor began treating patients for things he couldn't explain: phantom fevers, sudden fits of weeping, children forgetting their names. One boy went blind without any physical cause. He told his mother, "I looked at something I shouldn't have. I saw her and she saw me." Generations passed, but the shadow lingered. In the 1950s, long after the estate had been condemned, a group of college students came to Black Hollow hoping to explore the ruins. They brought cameras, tape recorders, supplies. None of them were ever officially reported missing, but their equipment was found scattered along the perimeter of the woods. The film all overexposed, the audio filled with static and something else. A humming, rhythmic, faint but unmistakably a tune. Locals claimed it matched the lullaby Amelia was said to hum when she was a child. And then there were the descendants. The Ashfords had no known living heirs, but distant relatives, cousins, in-laws, bloodlines that touched theirs even lightly, began to report unusual behavior across generations. Night terrors that began at exactly 3:17 a.m., obsession with mirrors, or the need to cover them. Recurring visions of a dinner table and a fifth guest who never speaks. One woman in Chicago claimed her daughter would draw the same symbol over and over again, the same circular glyph found on the Ashford ceiling nearly a century earlier. The daughter had never seen it, never been told the story, and yet she knew. Psychologists called it a hereditary delusion, a kind of mimetic contagion, a story so powerful it rewrites the minds of those who hear it. But that doesn't explain the physical effects, the seizures, the sleepwalking, the identical dreams. By the time modern researchers revisited the Ashford estate in the 1980s, what they found was no longer just a house. It was a place that fed on memory, on belief, a structure that no longer belonged entirely to this world. The lead researcher, Dr. Carl Howarth, spent just one night within the property's boundaries. He left before dawn, disheveled, eyes bloodshot, unable to speak in full sentences. His field notes stopped mid-sentence. "If I look at her again, I don't think I'll..." He never returned to academia. Took a job at a hardware store outside of Bangor. Never spoke of the estate again. What's most haunting isn't the house, or the family, or even what might have happened there. It's the fact that everyone who's touched this story, truly touched it, has unraveled, broken, gone, because it isn't just a mystery. It's a contagion, An emotional sickness that crawls into the quietest part of your mind and whispers, "It's not over." And maybe it never will be. Maybe what happened to the Ashfords isn't in the past. Maybe it's a pattern, waiting for the next family, the next vessel, the next town that refuses to believe, until it's too late. Asterisk, despite the silence that followed the Ashford vanishing, not everyone let the story rot in the soil of Black Hollow. Over the decades, a handful of researchers, journalists, and even occult scholars tried to peel back the layers of this unnerving mystery. They came with notebooks, Geiger counters, old maps, and tape recorders. Most left empty-handed, some left changed, and a few never left at all. Officially, the case remains unsolved. In 1901, 9 years after the disappearance, a government-funded investigation was quietly opened. It was never publicized, discovered only decades later through declassified correspondences between local law enforcement and Washington archivists. The letters spoke in code, referring to the Ashford house only as Site B6. They were brief, sparse, and then, after 1903, they stopped altogether. Rumors swirled. Some said the investigators had found remains in the basement, though no reports confirmed it. Others insisted something had been retrieved from the walls, an object, ancient and sealed in cloth. Whatever the truth, the house was sealed not long after, not condemned, not destroyed, just locked about as if someone somewhere believed that destroying it would only scatter whatever it held. Among researchers, 3 prevailing theories took hold over the decades, each chilling in its own way, each incomplete. The first is the occult ritual theory, perhaps the most widely accepted among folklore circles. According to this line of thought, Margaret Ashford was not merely dabbling in spiritualism, but fully immersed in ritualistic practice rooted in pre-Christian and Babylonian rites. Some believe the Ashfords intentionally isolated themselves to prepare for what they called a crossing of the veil, a kind of transformation that would allow their spirits or something darker to move between worlds. The ritual, they say, required silence, sacrifice, and something called the fifth offering. This may explain the 5 place settings, the journals, the strange glyphs, and the growing consensus that the disappearance wasn't an accident. It was the final stage of something ancient. But if that's true, the question becomes, what did they become? That leads to the second theory, the dimensional collapse hypothesis, popularized by fringe physicist Dr. Richard Averley in the 1970s. This theory suggests the Ashford estate exists at a naturally unstable point in physical space, a thin place, where reality can bend, allowing people or objects to cross into other dimensions. Dr. Averley visited Black Hollow twice and returned with a strange set of recordings. Static, electromagnetic pulses, and odd harmonic tone, repeating at exact intervals, 3 minutes and 17 seconds apart. The same time the clocks inside the house had all stopped. Averley postulated that the Ashfords either accidentally triggered a shift in dimensional frequency or did so deliberately, that they're still alive, just no longer in our version of time, existing instead in a kind of echo, watching us the way you might observe fish through glass. But if so, why does the estate remain hostile? Why do visitors still report voices, hallucinations, and sudden madness? That brings us to the final and perhaps darkest theory, the living house theory. In this interpretation, the Ashfords weren't conducting a ritual. They were feeding it. The house itself, built on cursed land, fueled by tragedy, had developed an identity, not a ghost, not a demon, but something more parasitic. A conscious presence formed through years of fear, isolation, and belief. This theory suggests that the estate lured the Ashfords into obsession, offering promises of contact with their lost sons, of transcendence. And when the time came, It consumed them, mind, body, and soul. Supporters of this theory point to the psychic deterioration of anyone who stays too long near the house. The hallucinations, the shared dreams, the sensation of being watched. They argue that the house is no longer simply haunted, it is haunting. Alive, aware, waiting. The FBI took interest briefly in 1971 when a file titled Operation Ashford surfaced during an internal paranormal research program. Agents reportedly attempted to collect soil samples from beneath the house, but none of the records were ever released. The program was shut down 2 years later, when pressed in interviews. A former agent, retired and dying of cancer, spoke only 2 words: "We failed." Today, urban explorers still make their way to Black Hollow, lured by internet forums, YouTube legends, and podcast theories. Mostly disappointed. The gate is always locked. The ground's overgrown. But those who sneak in often come back changed. One man described the interior of the house as breathing. He swore the wallpaper moved when you looked away. Another claimed to hear someone playing piano in the basement, though no stairs lead down from any room. And one woman, a self-proclaimed clairvoyant, entered the house and began weeping immediately. She said the air was filled with the presence of someone forever waiting for her family to finish dinner. No remains have ever been found. No official answers have ever surfaced. And perhaps that's the most chilling part of all, because when you reach the edge of the evidence, what's left is silence. The kind of silence that stretches for generations. And whether the Ashfords crossed into another world, or were consumed by the one they built, one thing is certain: something opened in that house, and it has never fully closed. Asterisk. The Ashford house still stands, its roof sagging under the weight of time, its shutters twisted and dangling like broken limbs. Ivy creeps up the stone facade like veins reaching for something just beneath the surface. And though no one has lived there in over a century, neighbors still say they see a faint flicker of light in the dining room, always around 7 p.m., as if someone is still lighting the candles for dinner. There is something inherently cruel about stories with no ending. They don't simply haunt the past. They echo into the present, lingering like a scent you can't place but can't shake either. The Ashfords were real. Their disappearance is real. Their house, their journals, the 5 empty chairs real. But the line between what happened and what we believe happened has long since blurred. And perhaps that's the point. What does it mean when a whole family vanishes without struggle, without a single cry for help? When dinner is set, but no one eats? When the clocks freeze, the lights never dim, and the door is left open, not broken, not forced, just open? What does it say about us as people? That we try to fill in the blanks with demons, dimensions, and darkness? Is it because we're afraid of what might really be behind it all? That it was just madness? That grief can rot the human soul until the walls themselves breathe with sorrow. That belief, untethered and unchecked, can transform a home into a mausoleum? Or worse, that there are places on earth, like Black Hollow, that were never meant for us? In the years since the incident, dozens of families have tried to resettle the land. None lasted more than a few weeks. Reports range from the mundane plumbing failures and structural issues to the bizarre. Children waking up speaking in languages they'd never learned. Furniture rearranging itself, and in one case, a man who awoke in the middle of the woods, 2 miles away with no memory of how he got there, only a dinner napkin in his hand with the letter A burned into it. And so, the Ashford house became something else entirely. Not a home. Not even a haunted house. A threshold. A place that feels like a waiting room for something worse. Something ancient. Something still listening. The journals that were recovered never explained the ritual. They never mentioned the disappearance. But Margaret Ashford wrote something in the final pages of her last known entry, a sentence almost too simple to be disturbing. And yet, it chills the blood more than any incantation ever could. She wrote, "They told us the only way out was to invite them in? Who were they? No one knows, or worse. Some people do, and they've simply never spoken. In 2012. A hiker passing through the forest claimed to find a locket near the river's bend. Inside was a tiny faded portrait, 4 children standing around a large dining table. A small note. Tucked behind the photo read, "We saved them from time." The hiker turned it in to local police. The locket disappeared from evidence within weeks. No explanation was ever given. A conspiracy? Or just more coincidence stacked atop decades of silence? Sometimes the most terrifying stories are not the ones with monsters and gore, but the ones that just stop leaving a hole so deep it feels like you could fall through it. And the Ashford story ends exactly like that. No grave, no explanation, just a house, still waiting, still hungry, a family-shaped absence that lingers like fog on the hill. Perhaps the final horror is this: the Ashfords might have succeeded in whatever they were trying to do. And maybe, just maybe, that's the reason no one's ever dared to tear the house down. Because whatever opened in that dining room over a century ago may still be open. Because some doors, once invited, never truly leave. So if one night you find yourself walking too close to the woods near Black Hollow, and you see a light flickering in the distance, and you hear the faint clink of silverware on porcelain, and you feel the air go still like the pause before something steps forward, turn back. Do not answer the whispers. Do not follow the melody of unseen music. Do not look in the window, even if someone inside looks just like you. Because the Ashford house isn't abandoned. It's waiting, and it remembers every face that comes too close.